Long time no see, gamers. I've been playing a lot of Kaeya lately, and he's a really cool character. But that doesn't mean he's not hot either, which, unironically, is the theme of this video. Today, I'm going to be going over how to build and play Kaeya so you can really maximize his damage. He's definitely really fun to play, obviously not as fun as someone like, oh, I don't know, Yoimiya. But you know, before we get started, you may have noticed my voice is not exactly what you expected. That's because I have COVID-19, so it's altered the pitch and tone of my voice quite a bit. It makes me sound way better than usual. I'll probably go back to sounding like I usually do soon, unfortunately, but in the meantime, let's get right into it. My name is Jen Braxophone, and let's talk about Kaeya.
But first, this video is sponsored by Slickdeals, an absolutely free browser extension that's super easy to use and saves you money. With Slickdeals, when you're browsing and shopping online, it'll automatically show you tons of offers, codes, and coupons that'll make finding what you need for a cheaper and easy task. One thing that I really like about Slickdeals is that there's a massive community surrounding it that's going to upvote the best deals and the most reliable deals, so that way those ones will be the ones that you see first. It can be super helpful for things like searching for new hardware, clothing, and general use coupons for sites like Amazon and more. I was really surprised to see how many amazing offers there were through the extension, and there's even more on slickdeals.net, where you can find all that Slickdeals has to offer in one place. Seriously, if you're doing the online equivalent of window shopping, go over to Slickdeals. You'll be surprised what you're able to find at a pretty reasonable price. Just casually looking around, I found a Radeon 6700 XT 12GB for over $100 below retail, and if I didn't just buy a new GPU a couple of months ago, I probably would have gone for it. If you enjoy saving money, which, let's be real, everyone does, click the link in the description right below this video. It's going to take you straight to the Slickdeals extension. It's super easy to get. You just follow the link, click add to browser, whether that's Chrome, Firefox, Opera GX, most browsers are going to work. And once it's added, just click this icon at the top of any page you're shopping on to find deals. Once again, link is in the description. I definitely recommend checking out Slickdeals.
As usual, we'll start off by going over Kaeya's kit. Kaeya is pretty underrated. He has a lot of great things about him as a damaging unit that people tend to overlook because he's one of the free characters you get at the start of the game. Something interesting about Kaeya right off the bat is that his basic attacks actually have high multipliers and are really good for early game damage. His elemental skill deals a cone of cryo damage in front of Kaeya that generates 2 to 3 particles per use, but can change with Kaeya's second ascension passive. For some reason, the description here is wrong. It says that Kaeya will generate extra particles by freezing enemies with his skill, but you actually get the particles even if enemies were frozen by another character. As long as the enemy is already frozen or gets frozen with Kaeya's skill, you'll generate up to 2 extra particles. It makes him a super strong battery if you're using him in freeze. Outside of that, his skill just hits really hard and is worth investing into. The cooldown is 6 seconds. Kaeya's elemental burst is a really powerful and underrated ability. When you cast it, it snapshots Kaeya's stats to maintain the same damage throughout the entire duration of his burst. It creates 3 icicles around Kaeya that rotate clockwise and deal cryo damage when they come in contact with an enemy. Each icicle has a short cooldown of half a second though, so sometimes you may not actually be hitting every enemy every time. His burst also follows standard internal cooldown rules, which is that it will only apply cryo either once every 3 hits or once every 2.5 seconds. Essentially, this means that Kaeya is good at using the reverse melt reaction, which is cryo being applied to an enemy with pyro on them to increase his damage substantially. The cooldown is 15 seconds and it costs a mid-60 energy. His burst is really strong and also worth investing into. Last 2 things. His first ascension passive gives Kaeya HP back based on 15% of his attack stat when he uses his skill. It's not that strong unless you're early on in the game, but it's not useless either. He also has a passive that reduces the stamina cost of sprint for your party, and while a lot of people write this off as not even a real ability, it will actually get you an extra dodge or 2 in the grand scheme of things, which can be helpful for harder content in some instances. As far as talent priority, level his burst and skill together, but burst gets more priority. And then you can level his autos, though I don't recommend it unless you're really early on in the game. Kaeya can be played in tons of different ways, but in this video, we're going to focus on his freeze and melt capabilities. While he can deal solid physical damage and superconduct in the early game, physical damage falls off pretty hard for most characters later on, and Kaeya's damage in freeze and melt are honestly just too good to pass up. With that being said, let's talk about Kaeya's artifact sets. As I, Braxophone, the real one and only Braxophone, always say in these videos, if you're early on in your Genshin Impact adventure, I don't recommend actually going out and farming for artifacts, since you're going to end up replacing them all anyways later on with 5-star artifacts. That being said, some of the best options for Kaeya before AR45 are going to be the Martial Artist set or the Berserker set for main DPS, since they increase normal and charged attack damage and crit rate respectively. You can also rent any 2-piece set with 18% attack bonus or 20% energy recharge as well. For main stats in the early game, prioritize attack percent Sands, cryo damage or attack percent Goblet, and an attack percent Circlet. Most guides will tell you to build crit, but that only really applies to late game unless you get pretty lucky with your artifacts, weapons, or characters early on. Freeze setups on Kaeya are super straightforward. The main thing you're going to want to run most of the time is 4-piece Blizzard Strayer. It's going to give you a 15% cryo damage bonus, which is already strong, but the 4-piece set is going to give you crit rate against enemies with cryo on them. 20% standard, 40% if the enemy is frozen. In most freeze teams, you'll want enemies to be frozen 100% of the time anyways, and the tons of crit rate that the set gives you lets you basically always run crit damage substats and circlet, which means this set is just insanely good. It also shares domains with the Heart of the Depth set, which is a good set to have 2 pieces for, since a bunch of Hydro units can use it. The only exception to this is if you're not running a character with 4 Noblesse in the team already, where Kaeya may actually bring more value by buffing your team with 20% attack bonus across the board. I mean, like, worst case, you can throw a mix of 2-piece 18% attack bonus sets, Emblem of Severed Fate, or Blizzard Strayer, but definitely farm up the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set if you plan on using him in Freeze. And I'm going to read this next part, verbatim, what it says on the script. If you're angry about that or disagree, you should probably, in quotes, cool it. If you're not using Kaeya in Freeze, you're probably thinking that bigger numbers are better than lots of small ones, and I get it. Big numbers are hot. If you want to run Melt Kaeya, you can use any of the sets that we talked about in Freeze Kaeya, except for the 4-piece Blizzard Strayer set. These would be any mix of a 2-piece 18% attack bonus set, 2-piece or 4-piece Noblesse, 2-piece Blizzard Strayer, 2-piece Wanderer's Troop, or 2-piece Emblem of Severed Fate. All of them have small effects that add to Kaeya's damage or uptime and can be useful. That being said, there is technically a definitive best-in slot for Reverse Melt, and it's 4-piece Lava Walkers, since it will boost all of his damage against enemies with Pyro on them. But I don't recommend farming for it because the damage increase you're seeing compared to the 2-piece combinations that were just mentioned is really small. I also wouldn't personally recommend going for a 4-piece Emblem set because it scales off a character's energy recharge, and generally speaking, Kaeya just doesn't need much of it, which can mean lower damage output. Plus, it's a 4-piece set, which can be harder to farm for than using 2 2-piece sets. We'll talk about energy recharge in the stats section, though. As is usual for damaging units, you want to use a combination of attack sands, a cryo damage goblet, and a crit circlet. Kaeya definitely likes energy recharge for burst uptime, but he doesn't need a lot. Since his ascension stat is energy recharge, he already has a decent amount of it from the get-go. If you're looking for specific numbers, I've found that 160% energy recharge gets me 100% uptime on his burst, but in freeze teams, you can actually go a little bit lower, like around 120 to 140%. Everyone's energy recharge needs will change based on the content you're in and how you play. So those numbers are more of a baseline to give you something to work off of rather than a hard set rule. In a reverse melt setup, you can opt for an elemental mastery sands, but whether or not it's better will depend on the content, amount of pyro application, amount of enemies, and more. For Kaeya specifically, because he follows standard internal cooldown rules and doesn't hit too fast with his burst, I prefer to keep him on attack sands. It's really up to you with your favorite pieces and substats. As usual with Genshin, it depends. As for deciding what kind of crit circlet you'll want, if you're in a freeze team, you should use a crit damage circlet 99.9% of the time. For reverse melt, you want to balance your crit stats so you have a 1-to-2 ratio of crit rate to damage. For example, 50 crit rate to 100 crit damage is a good starting point. For substats, focus on crit damage, crit rate, attack percent, energy recharge, and elemental mastery. Kaeya weapons are almost the same as Ayaka weapons. Since he doesn't need a ton of energy recharge to be functional, you just build him as a DPS and hope for energy recharge substats. To start off, in both freeze and reverse melt, all of the 5-star weapons are solid. Mist Splitter is your best choice, but Jade Cutter can also be extremely solid. Summit Shaper, Aquila Favonia, and Skyward Blade are also solid for Kaeya in most setups. Something that a lot of players are surprised by is Kaeya's ability to utilize Freedom Sworn. In a reverse melt setup, it has the Elemental Mastery main stat to buff his damage, but it's also just a solid weapon because Kaeya can activate its passive to buff your team. Wouldn't recommend for freeze as much, but definitely a good reverse melt option. On that same note, Alley Flash is another great reverse melt option for Kaeya, but if you're running freeze, definitely avoid it. Blackcliff, Aminoma, and Festering Desire are awesome 4-star options for Kaeya regardless of freeze or melt. Aminoma is just a safe bet in general because it's a free-to-play craftable weapon. Lion's Roar is a solid option too in reverse melt since enemies will basically always have pyro on them. Black Sword is a pretty good choice too. You just gotta make sure that you don't go past 100% crit rate if you run it in a freeze team. Lastly, Harbinger of Dawn, as always, is a decent option specifically because it's a crit machine. That being said, there's so many mechanics that drain your HP that it can be irritating to play around the passive. If you feel like you need more energy, you can opt for Favonius or Sacrificial, but in my personal testing, me, Braxophone, I haven't really needed the extra energy or passives. There are 10 billion weapons to talk about, and I wish I could talk about them all, but the video would just be too long. The nice thing about Kaeya is that tons of different weapons work well on him, which makes him pretty friendly to free-to-play players. Speaking of flexibility, let's move on to Kaeya's teams. Most cryo characters have tons of flexibility with teams because the element has a lot of useful reactions. The first team I want to go over is a reverse melt quick swap team featuring Kaeya, Rosaria, Xiangling, and Bennett. I mentioned this one in my Rosaria guide already, but the reason it's such a strong team is because you already have 3 strong damage dealers, Kaeya, Rosaria, and Xiangling, paired up with Bennett. Bennett's going to buff every character's burst, and since they all snapshot, all of the characters in this team will maintain Bennett's buff on their burst for the entire time it's used and also while off the field. To get use out of this team, start with Bennett EQ, Xiangling QE, Rosaria EQ, Kaeya EQ, then rotate through Bennett's skill, Rosaria skill, and Kaeya skill until you're ready to start the whole thing over again. It's a super easy to follow team and gets amazing damage. The next team I want to show you is the Meltao team, featuring Hu Tao, Xingqiu, Kaeya, and Rosaria. The idea behind this team is just amplifying your Hu Tao's damage through melts and vaporizes. It's pretty straightforward, you don't need a lot of healing in a Hu Tao team, and Xingqiu basically covers that. You can also opt for Ganyu in this team, and especially if you have Elegy to increase your team's elemental mastery. You could also throw Diluc in here, but for some reason everyone seems to be mad at him. I don't know why. The third team being showcased is your standard freeze team with Ayaka, Kaeya, a Hydro Flex, and an Anemo Flex. The Hydro could be someone like Mona or Kokomi, and the Anemo could be someone like Kazuha or Sucrose. Kaeya and Ayaka will output a lot of damage on their own, but Kaeya will also generate a lot of energy for Ayaka with his passive. You'll be able to spam Ayaka's burst pretty often and tear through content. You can also use Thrilling Tales on a Catalyst character to snapshot that buff onto either Ayaka or Kaeya bursts. And finally, the fourth team I have to show today is a Superconduct physical damage team. The team is Eula, Kaeya, Fischl, and Zhongli. Now, to be honest, this team is super flexible. You could run Razor instead of Eula, Raiden instead of Fischl, and Anemo instead of Zhongli, Diona instead of Zhongli. There's a lot of ways you could change the team up. The main idea is that you need to use Cryo and Electro to activate Superconduct to lower enemy physical resistance, and then just go to town with damage. The main reason to use Kaeya here is just because he deals solid damage. There are lots of great ways to use Kaeya in different teams, and these 4 teams aren't the only ones you can use, but they're great options if you want to add Kaeya to your roster. C6 and Kaeya is gonna be kind of a hard task, but let's go over them anyways just to give you guys an idea of what you have to look forward to. His first constellation gives him a crit rate bonus for normal and charge attacks against enemies with cryo on them. But if the enemy doesn't have that cryo aura, you're not getting the effect. Constellation 2 extends the duration of his elemental burst by 2.5 seconds every time an enemy is defeated with it active. I know the skill says every time Glacial Waltz defeats an opponent, but it can be any skill, ability, character, anything, as long as the burst is active. It's a really solid constellation that can be useless against bosses, but valuable against lots of enemies. His third constellation increases his skill level by 3, and Constellation 4 gives Kaeya a shield skill. Essentially, when Kaeya's HP falls below 20%, he'll automatically generate a shield worth 30% of his max HP. The biggest issue with this is that the shield only applies to Kaeya. If you switch to another character, they won't get Kaeya's shield. On top of that, it has a 60-second cooldown, and 28% HP is a dangerously low threshold. It's a really pretty constellation, just maybe not the most useful. Constellation 5 upgrades his burst by 3 levels. And Constellation 6 makes Kaeya generate an extra icicle during his burst and also refund 15 energy when you cast it. There's a few things that make this constellation insanely good. You get a ton more damage and chances to hit from the extra icicle, which is already awesome, but on top of that, you get to apply more cryo, which can open up new teams for him. With the 15 energy refund lowering his energy recharge requirements too, his Constellation 6 adds a ton of value to Kaeya. Braxophone, usually try and say whether or not it's worth going for constellations, but with the starter 4 stars, it's tough since they're so rare. If you really do want to get Kaeya's constellations, the one surefire way to do it is to wait for him to be in the monthly shop that rotates, since you're guaranteed to get him every once in a while. Cryo characters have a lot to live up to. There are so many strong cryo units in the game, and ones that deal solid damage, which is most of them. But the thing that sets Kaeya aside from the rest is that he is completely free to play. With access to so many artifact sets, weapons, and teams, Kaeya is incredibly flexible and easy to build for free-to-play players. His damage is super solid, and honestly, he's just pretty cool. I mean, he's no Yoimiya, but I guess, for a cryo unit, he's okay.
Okay, Jenny, that's enough. Cool it.
Sorry, who? My name is Braxophone.
Jenny.
Sorry, Josie Montana McCoy, voice of Kaeya. Okay, I'll be good.
Don't make me ice bridge my way over there and wrap this video up myself.
No, I got it. Get out of here. Kaeya's great, and definitely a unit worth building, especially if you haven't invested into the high-end cryo characters like Ayaka and Ganyu. And I hope this guide helped you find a way to use him effectively. Make sure to let me know in the comments if you found this video helpful, and if you enjoyed, consider subscribing to the channel. I also go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, and you should definitely come hang out. Again, that's spelled twitch.tv/JennyYokoborivo. That's how you spell Braxophone. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.